Announcements by the President. Prayers.
We read from the first letter of Peter, chapter 5, verses 2 to 4. These servants of God's word that is under your care, watching over them, not because you know, but because you are willing, as God wants you to be. Not actually becoming gain, but eager to serve. Not lording it over those entrusted to you, but being example to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that will never fade away. Let us pray. Gracious and loving Lord, in your holy name and presence, we gather this afternoon at this sitting of the Junior Senate of Antigua and Barbuda, as we also welcome the members of Young Women in Leadership. We take the opportunity to thank you for the men and women whom you have called to positions of leadership. We are grateful for the many ways you have blessed our nation through their commitment, dedication, and tireless service to the people. And in a very special way, we want to thank you for these young women who have completed their leadership training, and for the opportunity now given to them to serve you, their communities, and this nation. We lift them up to you and humbly ask that you may strengthen their will, enlighten their minds with your wisdom, guide their hearts with your truth, and direct their decisions with your justice. Inspired by the lives and examples of the leaders upon whose shoulders we now stand, may they always seek your will in all things they do, for the glory of your name, for the common good, and for the well-being of the people of this nation. May your purposes unfold through their service. May justice, peace, humility, and integrity guide all that is said and done today in this honorable house and throughout their leadership or their journey in leadership. We ask this prayer through Christ our Lord, as together we pray as Jesus has taught us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom. And may Almighty God bless and guide you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Madam Clerk.
Announcements by the President. Announcements by the President.
You may be seated. A humble good day to you, honorable members and honored guests present in this honorable house, giving support and bearing witness to this procession for the Antigua and Barbuda 2026 YWIL Cohorts procession. It is our humble hope which drives us, young women in faith, towards a future many before us did not have the freedom of mind to see. Young women in leadership. May God guide this procession, and of course, happy International Women's Month. Madam President, Madam Clerk.
Public business. The adoption of order paper.
I recognize Senator Francis.
I move for the motion to adopt the order paper as circulated.
I recognize Senator Humphreys.
I beg to second the motion.
The motion has been moved and seconded. All in favor say aye. All against say no. The ayes have it. The motion has been moved in accordance to how it's been circulated. Madam Clerk.
Motion.
I recognize Senator Francis.
Whereas Antigua and Barbuda's cannabis legislation framework comprised of the Misuse of Drug Act of 2014, 2018, 2019, and 2022, as well as the Cannabis Amendment Act of 2022, has undergone significant reforms over the past decade, shaping the nation's policy on decriminalization, graduate penalty system, medicinal use, and domestic cultivation, and regulatory oversight. And whereas the public and expert has raised diverse social, legal, economic, and public health impacts, as well as unequal experiences of opportunities posed by the law's enactment that merit a comprehensive review of the Act and its implementations. And whereas the implementation and enforcement of the cannabis law may have differentiated impacts by gender, particularly affected women, youths, persons with caregiving responsibility, and low-income households. And whereas this immense issue merits greater study of gender-responsive, socially informed, and forward-looking manner to ensure any legal reforms and/or the development of financial institutions and social support mechanisms to address issues arising from the cannabis legislation reform work are evidence-based and best serve the population's need. Madam President, today I rise in full support of the motion of establishing a joint select committee to review the cannabis laws of Antigua and Barbuda. Our government has had commendable progress in implementing the Misuse of Drugs Act of 2014, 2018, 2019, and 2024, as well as the Cannabis Amendment Act of 2022. This not only provides oversight over the distribution of cannabis, but also helps to elevate our medicinal capabilities within our healthcare system. These reforms reflect a significant shift in how our society approaches the cannabis policies. For all these significant reasons, it is our duty as representatives of the people of Antigua and Barbuda to establish this committee to ensure that the existing cannabis laws become a responsible to review the existing cannabis laws because a responsible government does not just pass reforms, it safeguards and ensures that its citizens are taken care of. However, Madam President, the support of this motion does not mean that our laws are fundamentally flawed. It simply recognizes that a good legislation must be effectively implemented, monitored, and evaluated. As times change, issues arise, implementations fall short, and new resources come into our knowledge, we must ensure to keep up to date. Madam President, an important area that requires our attention is educational institutions. Licensed cannabis personnel should be tasked with the Ministry of Social and Urban Transformation, as well as the Ministry of Education, Sports, and Creative Arts, to ensure our citizens of the nation receive adequate education, ensuring not only the old and young persons within our society are taken care of, but they fully understand the meaning behind this legislation act in the first place. Actions such as putting in community outreach programs could help our community across the nation of Antigua and Barbuda understand our reforms and help them enforce it properly as we intended to in the first place. Teaching workshops within our secondary school institutions, as teachers help grasp a better understanding of this program, they can better help our youths to understand the meaning behind these acts. There has been a significant misunderstanding towards the legislation, and through teaching programs of our secondary school institutions, we can help limit the amount of misuse of drug amendments among our youths. Our schools play a vital role in ensuring our youth understand the potential health risks associated with the misuse of cannabis, the legal amount and the responsibility of their behavior. Strengthening the educational institutions and awareness initiative in our institution will help reduce the misunderstanding, limit unnecessary exposure among our youth, and ensure the intentions of the legislation are clearly understood. Madam President, we must also consider allocating the necessary funds to establishing and properly developing rehabilitation institutions. Such facilities can help with the safeguarding vulnerable groups within our society, as well as provide necessary treatments and mental health forums to those within our society who turn to the misuse of drugs for whatever mental health problems they may be dealing with. Helping this institution come into play will help reduce misunderstanding and help cut out any use of abuse of the act within our communities. Madam President, I want to reiterate, the legislation alone does not guarantee protection. It is the consistent and effective implementation of the legislation that ensures the safety and the well-being of our citizens. We must have research specialists, adequate funding, the full support of our law, health, and educational sectors to ensure that we continue to do what the people of Antigua and Barbuda expect us to do. That is, ensure continuous public safety and development. This, Madam President, is why I stand before you today, issuing my full support in establishing a joint select committee to review the cannabis legislation. Because good governance is not just consistent, it learns and it acts on the best interest of its people. Thank you so much, Madam President.
Is there a seconder?
To second the motion and reserve the right to speak.
Be it resolved that this Parliament establish a joint select committee to conduct a comprehensive review of all cannabis-related legislation, including but not limited to the Misuse of Drugs Amendment Acts of 2014, 2018, 2019, and 2024, as well as the Cannabis Amendment Act 2022, as well as related policies and programs with a specific mandate. A motion has been moved and seconded. Will there be a debate? I recognize Leader of the Opposition, Senator Burton.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, honorable members of the Senate, viewing and watching audience, I rise as the Minority Leader of the Senate to address the motion of establishing a joint select committee to review the cannabis legislation in Antigua and Barbuda with a human rights approach and gender lens. Allow me to remind this honorable court of the purpose of a joint select committee. According to the UK government, it comprises members of both houses of parliament, created by a resolution to conduct investigations or consider measures. JSCs are crucial to democratic scrutiny and are done to hold the leader, cabinet members, and the cabinet itself accountable to its people. I don't know about you, but I'm tired of having laws passed with enforceable provisions. However, there is always a failure to enforce the said provisions. Earlier, the Honourable MP for St. Paul made mention of the many treaties and international conventions we have signed on to. But how many of them have been fully ratified into domestic laws? Let me be clearer. I am not opposed to the motion of a joint select committee. What I am opposed to is a half-thought committee that has given no clear breakdown of a realistic structure, budget, or human resources for the said committee. Keep in mind that our mandate is to you, the citizens of Antigua and Barbuda, the little man who is usually disenfranchised by the lack of check and balances brought about by these cannabis and drug legislation. We have all gotten the complaints, especially within our education sector, regarding the impact of the decriminalization of cannabis on our people. From my personal conversation with students, they will tell you, and I quote, "World boss say can," end quote. They themselves don't even understand the legislation before them. On the job sites, on the streets, in public places, we see the lack of disregard and disrespect brought about. Do you know why there's such a disregard? Madam President, it is because there are no enforced checks and balances in place. Just imagine. If there is a JSC, I believe that the members of the committee should not be burdened by no more than one other responsibility. This ensures that during this one-year period allotted to them, they are reasonably given enough time and resources to ensure that the mandate of this committee is carried out. Let's be clear, a year is a very short period, and this motion, there's a lot of work to be done. It's not one piece of legislation, there's a whole lot to be looked at. A member who might hold multiple positions might give something, but let's be real, can they really give their best if they're split between 2 and 3 and many other positions? Madam President, I further propose that this committee, if it becomes one, has a 50-50 gender ratio. I recommend this at a committee level and staffing level. But this question speaks again to the gender disparity that's there. Within our parliament, how many women do we have in parliament? We only have one in the lower house. In addition, and most importantly, I believe that the committee should have a structured timeline during this review period. This ensures that they remain firmly aware of the mandate that they have and routinely give accounts to Parliament, as I believe that this will have an impact on the other motions and bills before Parliament during this time period. Madam President, the cannabis legislative framework is not single-faceted. It is multiple-faceted, and it has a significant impact on different areas of society. I have personally seen the impact when I go to court in labor, family, and domestic violence-related matters, just to name a few. In a wider scheme of things, in this motion before the House, There are many duties that overlap with already established roles and jobs within government ministries and statutory bodies. What is stopping us from maintaining the status quo? Why not properly fund, staff, and resource these positions to ensure that the work gets done? This will allow for a proper allocation of a budget that's already spent. We ain't got no money. Madam President, I have been through this motion with a fine-tooth comb, and I have seen no mention of the budget allocation or the source of this budget. Again, we don't got any money. To be honest, and if I'm being realistic, I find it more appropriate to fix the roads. I don't know about you, but my journey is to John Hughes, and you don't want to drive the route going there. Putting in our proper street lights. I'm still waiting on some ever since I was a child going to primary school, and look at me working now. Reopening our clinics. Our elderly have to travel far. And supporting our farmers with the appropriate infrastructure. Do you know the amount of money we spent on import just on food alone in a given year when our farmers are there and so much arable land is there? But you know, these are not the issues before us today. And so let me not digress too much. I believe that now is not the time. I believe that until that we can see a clear structure of what the JSC is supposed to do, I think that this motion should not be passed. The issues that I've mentioned and that my colleagues will mention today, Madam President, I beg of you to take heed and listen. Listen, we're not just opposing for opposing's sake. I know those on the other side like to say that's what we like to do. But we are looking at the thing before us. We're looking at the bigger picture. Is this how we should be spending our time and resources? The roads are there. Tourism is our main industry. You interact with the tourists. Yeah, Antigua is so lovely. But there's always that but. We cannot be an industry driven by tourism, and we have these as the simple feedback that we're getting. Ladies say that we don't have enough hotel room to fit them. That's something I can work with, because we can simply get more things in place for them. But I think our resources are better spent not passing this motion and having enforcement of the already laws that are there. I stand.
Thank you, Senator Burton. You may turn off your mic. I recognize Senator Humphreys.
Madam President, honorable members, I rise today in the capacity of Deputy Leader in Government Business to support the establishment of a Joint Select Committee to conduct a review of our cannabis legislation. Madam President, sound legislation is much like construction of a building. A responsible builder does not lay a foundation and simply walk away. Over time, the structure must be inspected, reinforced, and adjusted to ensure that it is strong, safe, and capable of serving the people it is meant for. Our cannabis legislation is no different. The establishment of a Joint Select Committee provides this Honourable Parliament with the opportunity to examine the structure we have built, to determine what is working, identify where improvements are needed, and to ensure the benefits of this developing industry are not confined to a few, but are accessible to all. Madam President, at its core, it's about human rights and fairness. Our honorable opposition mentioned about budget, but are we mentioning human rights and fairness? Laws governing economic activity function much like gates to a marketplace. When those gates are open, clearly regulated, and fairly accessible, enterprise and opportunity can flourish. But when the gates is narrow or accessible only to a select few, many capable citizens remain outside, unable to participate in lawful economic activity. That's government business. That's our budget. A joint select committee allows the examination of our cannabis legislation and ensures constitutional principles of equality, fairness, and justice are maintained. Madam President, legal reform in this sector affects a wide range of stakeholders: our youth, ordinary citizens, small-scale farmers, entrepreneurs, medical professionals, and investors. Each of these deserve the opportunity to be heard. A joint select committee would allow Parliament to engage in these voices, consult in experts in law, public health, human rights, and regulatory governance. Ensure this Joint Select Committee will ensure that any reforms emerging from the review are grounded in facts, lived experience, and sound governance. Madam President, we must ask, should the opportunities created by this emerging industry be limited to a select few? A Joint Select Committee allows us to address gaps, the same gaps that our honorable opposition mentioned: public education, regulation, and policing. Without clear rules and effective oversight, confusion can arise. Enforcement may become inconsistent.
You have a minute, honorable member.
Thank you, Madam President. And vulnerable groups, particularly our young people, may be placed at risk. Government has the responsibility to safeguard the stability and integrity of our economy. Matters such as licensing systems, regulatory processes, taxation, and revenue must function in a manner that protects long-term interests of this country. That's where our economic system comes from. Economic growth in this sector strengthens the broader economy rather than benefiting a narrow segment. Madam President, a legislative review is not a sign of weakness. It shows that Parliament is willing to examine its work, listen to its people, and ensure that our laws continue to serve the national interests. Today, we have the opportunity to take a careful and responsible step to review, improve, and ensure that the growth of this sector strengthens our economy, protects our young people, and expands opportunity for all. For these reasons, Madam President, I support the establishment of a Joint Select Committee.
Thank you, honorable member. You may turn off your mic. Would anyone else like to speak? I recognize Senator Blackstock.
Madam President, esteemed members of the Senate, opposition. Madam President, as civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "The time is always right to do what is right." It is in that spirit of responsibility, thanks, babe. It's in that spirit of responsibility and good governance that I rise in support of this motion to establish a joint select committee to review cannabis legislation in Antigua and Barbuda, particularly the Cannabis Act 2022. Alongside the Misuse of Drugs Amendment Act of 2014, 2018, 2019, and 2024. Madam President, the Misuse of Drugs Amendment Act 2018 marked an important moment in our legislative journey. It signaled a shift in our national approach to cannabis by reducing penalties for the possession of small quantities and moving us towards a more balanced and humane approach to the framework. That reform laid important groundwork for the broader regulatory structure that would later emerge under the Cannabis Act 2022. The Cannabis Act 2022 represents a significant reform in our legislative framework. It established a regulatory authority for cannabis oversight. It created licensing system for cultivation, processing, and distribution. It recognized medicinal cannabis and sacramental use. It introduced compliance, enforcement, and enforcement mechanisms. Madam President, this reform was transformative. However, all major legislative reforms must be reviewed to ensure the implementation reflects the original intent of the Parliament. First, the regulatory effectiveness. We must assess whether licensing procedures are transparent, whether small local cultivators can participate meaningfully, and whether the authority has the resources required to fulfill this mandate. Opposition, I hope you're listening and paying attention. Second, economic and physical outcomes. The Act envisions economic opportunities. Therefore, we must examine revenue generation, administrative costs, employment creation, and whether economic beliefs are being distributed fairly within the industry. Thirdly, human rights and gender consideration. The legislation recognizes medical and sacramental use. Yet, we must ensure access to medicinal cannabis is equitable, that women entrepreneurs are not disadvantaged within licensing system, and that the reform beginning with the Misuse of Drugs Amendment Act 2018 have reduced disproportionate enforcement. Having this community, we are able to make medicinal cannabis and licensing affordable. Fourth, public health safeguard. Cannabis regulation must also protect public health.
Honourable Member, you have a minute left.
I acknowledge you, Madam President. This includes reviewing educational initiatives, youth protection measures, mental health consideration, and the adequacy of data collection to guide policy decision. Madam President, post-legislative structures is a hallmark of responsible governance. Establishment of a joint select committee does not weaken the Cannabis Act 2022. It strengthens it by ensuring that the framework remains effective, equitable, financially accountable, and responsive to the needs of the people. In closing, the reforms begins with the Misuse Act, Amendment Act 2018, and continuing through the Cannabis Act 2022, marked a new chapter in Antigua and Barbuda. Antigua and Barbuda's policy development. It is now our responsibility to evaluate their implementation through evidence, consultation, and careful oversight. For this reason, I support the motion, and I urge this House, this Honourable House, to do the same. I thank you. President, I rest.
Thank you, Honourable Member. I recognize Senator Jeffrey.
Madam President, colleagues, as an independent center for Barbuda, supporting the establishment of a joint select committee on cannabis legislation, I rise today in strong support of the motion before this Honourable House that Parliament establish a joint select committee to conduct a comprehensive review on all cannabis-related legislation in Antigua and Barbuda. Madam President, as legislators, one of our core responsibilities is to post-legislative inspection, ensuring that the law we pass continue to be relative, effective, and responsive to the needs of our people. Today, we are taking an important step toward fulfilling that responsibility. Our current cannabis framework is fragmented and in some areas outdated. It touches public health, criminal justice, education, gender affairs, economic development, and community well-being, but it does so in ways that are not always aligned, not always clear, and not always grounded in evidence. This is precisely why the establishment of a joint select committee is both timely and necessary. Madam President, as an independent senator representing Barbuda, I am especially mindful of how national legislation affects small island communities. For Barbuda, the impact of cannabis legislation, whether related to policy and economic opportunity or youth development, must be understood within our unique social and cultural context. The Joint Select Committees offer the ideal meeting to ensure these realities are not overlooked. The motion also mandates the application of gender and intersectional lens across the committee's work. This is vital. We know that the law does not impact everyone equally. In Barbuda, women, youth, low-income households, and rural communities often experience both the harm and the opportunity of legislation in different ways. By examining how cannabis law intersect with genders, geographic, socio-economic status, health status, and age, we strengthen our commitment to equity and uphold the human rights obligations set out in the Constitution and in the international treaties to which Antigua and Barbuda is a part. The committee is also tasked with reviewing support mechanisms, public health programs, community education, social services, and training initiatives to ensure that our cannabis framework is not only enforceable but humane, people-centered, and development-oriented. It must identify implementation gaps, unintended consequences, inconsistencies, and areas where reform is appropriated. Furthermore, the committee will assess the financial resource and budgetary allocation required to support effective and equitable implementation. Too often, legislation is passed without the necessary funding to make it work. This process helps avoid that pitfall. Madam President, this review is not about rushing towards liberalization or towards greater restriction. It is about ensuring that whatever we decide now or in the future is guided by clarity, fairness, evidence, and live reality of our people. Clarity in the legislation benefits everyone. It strengthens public trust. It guides law enforcement. It supports economic opportunities, and it protects our youth. Most importantly, it positions our Twin Island state, my home, to move forward with the cannabis policy that is effective, equitable, gender responsive, people-centered, and evidence-driven. Colleagues, I fully support this motion. I commend its commitment to fulfill its debt and its alignment with good governance. And I commit, as always, to bring Barbuda's voice, experience, and perspective into this national process. Let us seize this opportunity to modernize our law responsibility and to craft a framework that truly serves all the people of Antigua and Barbuda. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Member. I recognize Senator Michael.
Madam President, I rise in support of the motion to establish a joint select committee to review Antigua and Barbuda's cannabis legislative framework. Before I expound on why I support this motion, let me first clarify exactly what a joint select committee is for the not so politically inclined amongst us. In layman terms, a joint select committee is a special group made up of members from both houses of legislature that is created to examine a specific issue in detail. Madam President, if I may offer a simple example from everyday life. When parents are faced with an important decision concerning their child's well-being, they really make that decision in isolation. They speak with each other, sometimes consulting doctors, teachers, and even other family members. This is because they understand that when multiple perspectives are considered, the final decision is usually stronger and more balanced. A joint select committee operates in much the same way. Now that you're more informed, you can see where I'm going with this, can't you? Just imagine the unbiased assessment of complex issues. Imagine an open discussion where all perspectives are heard fairly. Imagine a forum where facts are prioritized over opinions and emotions. Imagine solutions being proposed based on evidence rather than conjecture. This is what the establishment of a joint select committee brings to the table and why it is the most appropriate mechanism to undertake this review. Such a committee would allow members from both houses to examine the legislation comprehensively, consult with stakeholders, including law enforcement, educators, substance abuse specialists, legal practitioners, and community representatives, and assess how the law functions on a day-to-day basis. It provides a structured and transparent forum to identify errors, clarify ambiguities, and make recommendations grounded in evidence rather than assumption. Given the national impact of cannabis reform, a careful and consultative review is not only prudent, it is responsible. Over the past several years, Antigua and Barbuda has amended its cannabis law under the Misuse of Drug Amendment Act. While this reform was significant, a serious problem has emerged. Many citizens appear to be of the opinion cannabis use is legal. As a result, we see public smoking in streets, in vehicles, in fetes, and many other shared community spaces. However, contrary to popular belief, the law permits limited private use. It does not legalize or permit public consumption. The issue before us is not simply cannabis use. The issue before us is confusion, the general misconception of an entire nation. What exactly constitutes a public space? Where are the boundaries? What are the penalties? What is permitted inside a home versus outside? When the public does not clearly understand the law, enforcement becomes inconsistent. Tension increases between citizens and police, and respect for legislation weakens. Even more concerning is the growing visibility of minors using cannabis. We are seeing children as young as 11 years old experimenting openly, often without understanding the legal consequences or development risk. Whether one supports reform or not, we can all agree that our young people must be protected.
I ask that your phones are mute or turned off, please.
Cracks in public education, cracks in parental awareness, and cracks in structured guidance surrounding the law. Madam President, without immediate attention to these cracks, our very foundation is likely to crumble. Needless to say, these same cracks could have been avoided had such a committee been established proactively. Fact of the matter is...
You have a minute, Honourable Member.
Thank you, Madam President. And with your indulgence, I would like a brief extension just to conclude my remarks.
I'll give you 30 seconds more.
The inconsistent enforcement, the public use in prohibited spaces, and the troubling exposure of our children all stem from a common root: a lack of clarity, communication, and structured oversight of our cannabis laws. This is exactly why a joint select committee is not just appropriate, it is paramount. Had such a committee been established, I can almost guarantee much of this confusion and risk could have been mitigated. Clear boundaries could have been defined, public awareness campaigns crafted, and safeguards for our youths implemented, all before the misconception became widespread. The committee is a mechanism for oversight, for foresight, not just hindsight, for responsible governance, not reactive measures. Madam President, if nothing else that I have said here today resonates with this honourable House, let this be the key takeaway. In short, Madam President, the Joint Select Committee is our best tool to prevent further erosion of respect for the law, to protect our young people, and to ensure that cannabis reform in Antigua and Barbuda achieves its intended purpose safely, fairly, and transparently. For these reasons, I firmly support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Member. I recognize Senator Pearson.
Honourable President, distinguished colleagues of this upper house, along with my colleagues, I rise today to strongly support the motion to establish a joint select committee to review cannabis legislation in Antigua and Barbuda through a human rights and gender-responsive lens. Over the past decade, Antigua and Barbuda has undertaken a significant transformation of its cannabis legislation framework through the Misuse of Drugs Act of 2014, 2018, 2019, 2024, and the Cannabis Amendment Act of 2022. These reforms move our country towards decriminalization, medicinal cannabis legislation, and limited domestic cultivation, reflecting a broader regional shift towards modernized drug policy. However, responsible governance does not end with passing legislation. It requires continuous evaluation. As outlined in the motion before this chamber, Parliament has a duty of post-legislative scrutiny, ensuring that laws remain effective, equitable, and aligned with the life reality of our people. Establishing a joint select committee would allow Parliament to systematically evaluate the social, legal, economic, and public health impact of these reforms and to determine whether the intended outcomes, reduced criminalization, expanded medicinal access, and regulated economic opportunities, are being achieved. Honourable members, the review proposed in this motion is particularly important because cannabis policies intersect with human rights, public health, and social equity. International human rights bodies increasingly emphasize that drug laws must be proportionally and non-discriminatory. The United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime has noted that drug policies must be balanced with respect for human rights and public health consideration. Within our national context, concerns have emerged regarding how cannabis legislation made differently, particularly in relation to criminal records, access to medicinal cannabis, and participation in the emerging cannabis economy. The motion's mandates that the committee apply a gender and intersectional lens, thereby reflects best practices in modern policy evaluation. It recognizes that individuals may experience legislation differently depending on socioeconomic status, caregiving responsibilities, age, or geographic location. By consulting experts in public health, gender affairs, law enforcement, academia, and civil society, the committee would ensure that the review is evidence-based and inclusive, thereby strengthening public trust in our legislative process. Importantly, this approach aligns Antigua and Barbuda with evolving legislative trends across the Caribbean region. Madam President, for example, Jamaica's Dangerous Drugs Amendment Act of 2015 decriminalized possession of small quantities of cannabis and legalized its use of religious and medicinal purposes. The Jamaican government recognized that reform must also address social justice concerns, as stated by the Government of Jamaica, Ministry of Justice, and I quote, "The amendment sought to correct the disproportionate impact of cannabis criminalization on marginalized communities while regulating a legislative industry." Similarly, Madam President, Barbados Medicinal Cannabis Industry Act of 2019 established a regulatory framework for cultivation, emphasizing economic diversification and public health safeguards.
May you please silence your phone?
Meanwhile, Madam President, St. Vincent and the Grenadines passed the Cannabis Industry Regulation Act of 2020, creating a cannabis authority to oversee licensing, while also introducing an amnesty program for small traditional farmers who had previously been criminalized. These examples demonstrate that across the Caribbean region, governments are not only reforming.
You have a minute left, Honorable Member.
Thank you, Madam President. But also reforming and refining them to ensure fairness, economic inclusion, and effective regulation. Antigua and Barbuda must refrain equally vigilant in evaluating whether our own legislation delivers similar outcome. These regional experiences reinforce an important principle: legislation must evolve alongside evidence and societal needs. By mandating that the committee report back to Parliament within 1 year with findings and recommendations, this motion ensures that our cannabis legal framework remains effective, equitable, and responsive to emerging realities. In closing, Honorable President and members of this chamber, supporting this motion is not about reopening settled policies, debates on cannabis. Rather, it is...
Your time is up.
Thank you, Madam President.
I recognize Senator Thomas.
Honorable Madam President, fellow senators, I rise today as an independent senator on the opposition benches to respectfully but firmly oppose this motion to establish a joint select committee to review all cannabis legislation. This is not a debate about whether Parliament should review legislation. Post-legislative scrutiny is indeed an important responsibility. However, the question before us is whether this particular committee, at this particular time, and with this particular mandate, is an appropriate course of action for our nation. First, Madam President, we must consider the social implications of the path we're being asked to take. Over the last decade, this Parliament has already enacted a series of significant reforms to the cannabis legislation. The Misuse of Drugs Amendment in 2014, 2018, 2019, and most recently as 2024, along with the Cannabis Amendment Act of 2022, collectively represents one of the most extensive policy shifts in our modern legislative history. Those reforms were not adopted lightly. They followed years of consultation, debate, and public engagement. Our society is still adjusting to such changes. Communities, schools, and religious institutions are still grappling with the cultural and behavioral consequences of the partial normalization of cannabis use. Many parents and educators remain deeply concerned about how changing legal norms affect young people's perception of risks. When we signal once again that the entire legislative framework is up for reconsideration, we risk creating further confusion about the direction of national policy and the social message we send to our youths. Secondly, I wish to address the legal implication. The motion proposes that this committee conduct a comprehensive review of virtually the entire cannabis legislative framework within 1 year. That is a tremendously broad mandate. It touches criminal law, regulatory policies, religious accommodation, medicinal frameworks, economic licensing regimes, and public health oversight. Madam President, when Parliament repeatedly established committees to relitigate settled legislative framework, we risk weakening institutional clarity. Law should provide predictability. Citizens, business, and regulators must know the rules of the game and trust that those rules will not be placed under perpetual reconsideration. Third, and most perhaps importantly, Madam President, we must consider the public health dimension. Since reforms were introduced, health professionals across the region have warned about the potential consequences of increasing accessibility and normalization, particularly among adolescents and young adults whose brains are still developing. Madam President, in 2016, based off of a student survey that was done with the Organization of American States, Antigua was ranking 3rd within the nation, within the region, for marijuana usage. 3rd! At this moment, our health systems are already confronting serious pressures from non-communicable diseases, mental health challenges, and limited public health resources. Madam President, if we are to review the cannabis policy, that process must be grounded in long-term population-based data, rigorous public health research, and careful medical evaluation. We must avoid a situation where policy debates move faster than science needed to guide them. In closing, Madam President, I reiterate that I support the evidence-based policymaking and thoughtful legislative review. However, the proposal before us is overly broad, premature, and potentially disruptive to social stability, legal clarity.
Honourable Member, you have a minute left.
The reforms we have already enacted deserve time to be implemented, monitored, and evaluated through the appropriate institutional channels. For those reasons, I cannot support this establishment of the Joint Select Committee at this time. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Honourable Member. You may turn off your mic. I recognize Senator Burton, John Burton.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I rise today to express my support for the cannabis reform, establishing a joint committee to review the cannabis legislation in Antigua and Barbuda with a human rights approach. Again, a human rights approach. Good morning to my colleagues and also members on the other side. But before I give my contribution towards this reform, I would like to say condolences to the family, friends, and loved ones of the Honorable late Tico Lake. Madam President, I would like to say that I am in strong agreement with this legislation. By establishing a joint committee, we are demonstrating maturity in a joint governance. We are saying to the people of Antigua and Barbuda that this reform is not static. It revolves, it responds, it improves. We are strengthening legitimacy. We are strengthening transparency. We are strengthening public trust. Madam President, this is not political alignment, right? This is about governance. Madam President, this is not against, Madam President, this is not about political alignment. It is about ensuring that our cannabis reform remains effective, equitable, people-centered, and grounded in evidence. Madam President, this Honorable House took this bold, progressive step with the passage of the Cannabis Act 2018 alongside the amendments of the Misuse of Drugs legislation. We modernize our approach to the cannabis, recognizing religious freedoms, establishing a medicinal system, and also introducing ordinance oversight. Those reforms were necessary. They were courageous. They were forward-thinking. Madam President, legislation is not static. It must live, it must breathe, it must be evaluated. Madam President, some may say, Madam President, why now? The law has already been amended. Madam President, this is a review, and a review is not a reversal. A review is responsibility. Post-legislative scrutiny is a cornerstone of good governance. When a law reshapes Criminal Justice Limited, establishing licensing framework, creates administration body, and open economic sectors. Parliament has a duty to assess how those changes function in practice. If the law is not working, this reform will confirm it. If there are gaps, we will strengthen it. Madam President, and to the members on the other side, this is not weakness. This is good leadership. When we plant a seed, Madam President, do we just plant the seed and leave it? No. Guess what? We water it, so we plant our seed, we water it, and also we monitor its growth. And now, that is what you call good governance. Madam President, when it comes to the human rights approach, decriminalization...
Honourable Member, you have a minute left.
President, decriminalization in Antigua and Barbuda has helped many citizens by preventing minor offenders from receiving criminal records for small possession, which would have prevented persons charged with cannabis from getting jobs and also limited other opportunities. Madam President, it also respects cultural and religious practices which reduce unnecessary stigma and discrimination. A law may act neutral, yet impact citizens differently. Responsible governance requires that we examine the lives' realities, not ignore them. Madam President, responsible governance does not end at amendment. Post-legislative scrutiny is a standard Parliament function matures democracies. This motion does not reopen ideological debates. It strengthens implementations. It enhances accountability. It ensures that our framework remains effective, equitable, and responsive to the people that we serve. Madam President, I affirm that this motion, 1, our commitment to evidence over consumption, 2, our commitment to fairness over exclusion, 3, our commitment to human rights and responsible governance. In closing, Madam President, I wholeheartedly support this reform with a joint committee, encouraging the honourable members on the other side to do the same. Madam President, only fragile policies avoid scrutiny. Strong policies welcome it. This government has nothing to fear. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Honourable Member. I recognize Senator Moses.
Madam President, Honourable Senators, today this chamber is asked to establish a joint select committee to review cannabis legislation in Antigua and Barbuda with a Human Rights and Gender Responsive Act approach. This motion asks Parliament to consider whether a special committee should be created to conduct a comprehensive review of our current cannabis laws and examine their social, legal, economic, and public health impacts. While the intention behind such a review may be well-meaning, it is important for this chamber to carefully consider whether establishing another committee is truly necessary at this time. Honourable Senators, let us consider the practical implications of creating a joint select committee. Such committees often require extensive consultations, multiple meetings, and detailed reports before their work is completed. In many cases, this process can take many months, sometimes even up to a year. Madam President, the real question before this chamber is not whether we can form another committee. The real question is whether doing so will actually improve the legislative process or merely delay meaningful action the people of Antigua and Barbuda are waiting for. Citizens expect their leaders to act responsibly and efficiently. They expect Parliament to address national issues in a timely manner rather than prolonging them through unnecessary procedures. It is important to recognize that our country already has institutions and departments capable of providing the expertise needed to review legislation. The Statistics Division plays an important role in collecting and analyzing national data. This information helps policymakers understand social trends, economic impacts, and behavioral patterns within our society. When examining cannabis legislation, Such data can provide valuable insights into issues such as public health outcomes, enforcement trends, and the economic opportunities associated with cannabis-related industries. Additionally, the Legal Affairs Department already provides the legal expertise needed to examine legislation and ensure it is up to hold our Constitution and the law and rule of law. Madam President, it is their expertise that enables them to identify the legal gaps, potential conflicts, and areas where our policy require real and necessary improvement. With all due respect, Madam President, honorable senators, establishing another committee to repeat work that institutions are already capable of performing may not be the most efficient use of Parliament's time and resources. Instead of creating additional layers of bureaucracy, we should focus on strengthening and utilizing the systems that are already in place. This does not mean the scrutiny should be avoided. Carefully examination of legislation is essential, particularly when dealing with policies that may affect public health, law enforcement, and the development of our youth. However, scrutiny does not always require the creation.
Honorable Member, you have a minute left.
Madam President, the expertise already exists within our national institutions and within Parliament itself. Responsible governance requires not only careful analysis, but also timely action. Honorable Senators, we must ask ourselves a simple but important question. What do the citizens of Antigua and Barbuda need right now? Do we truly need another year of meetings and discussions? Or do we need practical actions and responsible governance now? For these reasons, I question the necessity of establishing a joint select committee at this time. Let us instead make effective use of the institutions and expertise that are already serve our nation. Madam President, I thank you.
Thank you. I recognize Senator Johnson.
Madam President, over the last decade, Antigua and Barbuda has been rewriting its story on cannabis. From the Misuse of Drugs Amendment Acts of 2014, 2018, 2019, and 2024 to the Cannabis Amendment Acts of 2021 and 2022. We have shifted from strict bans towards regulation, medicinal access, and economic opportunities. But the reality is more complex. While some citizens are thriving, starting businesses, accessing medicine, and seizing new opportunities, others, including women, youth, caregivers, and low-income families, sometimes feel left behind. It is like handing someone a Ferrari and forgetting to teach them how to drive. These are some of the questions that are being asked across our communities. Are these laws working as intended? Are they fair and accessible to all? Are unintended barriers being created as the old ones are removed? It is in full support of this resolution that I stand to establish a joint select committee tasked with examining our cannabis legislation in a thorough, human-centered, and evidence-based way. This committee will not only review the laws, they will engage deeply with the people affected by them. This committee will consult 1. Technical experts in public health, social development, and gender affairs, 2. Legal scholars, 3. Community organizations, 4. Youth groups and caregivers, and producers and medical professionals. This ensures that the voices of everyone impacted, especially women and vulnerable populations, are heard. The committee will identify gaps in the system, examining social, legal, economic, and public health impacts on cannabis legislation. They will also apply a human rights and gender lens to understand how women, youth, and marginalized groups experience the law and to assess the outcomes of this review. These two, monitoring access to medicinal on budgeting. The committee will review past allocations to the medicinal cannabis and recommend sources to strengthen implementation. Families navigating healthcare, women balancing businesses and caregiving, youth dreaming of opportunity, and citizens seeking fairness resolution. Let us establish this joint
I appreciate that the honorable members of the opposition side acknowledges that work needs to be done. However, meaningful reform takes time. Rome was not built in a day. And I can assure you that this honorable House that we are committed, and this is why we are establishing a joint select committee. And I trust that when the invitation participate, deliberate steps in reform-based cannabis. Move towards decriminalization, not with of their own home, not in public space. Is reflected in the reforms introduced under the Misuse Drugs Amendment Act in 2018. of the law. And this is why I am in full support of the establishment of a joint to review how these laws are functioning in practice and spiritual traditions of communities such the existence of these laws, but how effectively we implement them. And from the perspective of Ministry of Health, in which I'm representing today, this review is particularly important because cannabis policy is not only a legal issue, but it's also a public health issue. We must examine how cannabis use affects mental health, youth behavior, and community well-being. Enforcement of the law must therefore go hand in hand with education and awareness. Madam President, the resolution also speaks about human rights, and that's why we're here today. And we must consider the rights of all citizens. Whereas individuals may have the freedom to consume cannabis within the limits of the law, but equally, members of the public have the right not to be exposed to smoke in public spaces. Just as our law prohibits the public burning of garbage and the restriction of cigarette smokes in certain areas, our cannabis law seeks to ensure that one person's freedom does not infringe upon another person's right to a healthy environment. And most importantly, when we speak about human rights, the law protects our children. No child should be exposed to cannabis use, no child should be sold cannabis, and no child should be confined in a vehicle where cannabis is being smoked. No, we are seeing situations where young people are arriving at school under the influence. Then clearly, Madam President, this is not simply the law, it's not the issue, but enforcement and education awareness is needed. Madam President, this is where the work of the Joint Select Committee becomes critical. By consulting health professionals, educators, community leaders, youth organizations, the committee can ensure that our policies are supported by strong public education and evidence-based strategies.
I rise on a point of order, Madam President.
I recognize Senator Burton.
The use of the enforcement that you're looking for, I thought that was the job of the police and those organizations and not the committee. I don't believe that's the role of the committee, so if you could just clear that up for me, please, Senator.
That's not a point of order. You may continue, Senator Percival.
All right. Thank you, Madam President, and I hope that I can get an extra 30 seconds
I could give you a minute.
Thank you. Now, when I speak about enforcement, and the reason why I use the word enforcement in my presentation today is because this issue should not just be on one or two or three organizations. It should be looked at a whole setting. It should be the responsibility of the government, it should be the responsibility of different organizations, it should be the responsibility of us as citizens of Antigua and Barbuda. Health is wealth, and if we want a healthy nation, we have to put in the work, right? But I guess our opposition maybe needs some more clarification, but we'll discuss afterwards because I only have a short amount of time. But as I wrap up this resolution, it's not simply about changing the laws here, Madam President. It's also about reviewing and strengthening and enforcing the intention that have guided our reforms for nearly a decade. And through the Joint Select Committee, Antigua and Barbuda can ensure that its cannabis framework remains responsible, balanced, protective of public health, and respectful of all rights of citizens. May it please you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Percival. I recognize Senator Chambers.
Thank you, Madam President. Today we support the establishment of a joint selected committee to review the cannabis law in Antigua and Barbuda. This motion is not about changing the law right now. It is about elevating whether the law works effectively and fairly for everyone. In 2018, the Cannabis Act introduced important reinforcement. Small amount under 15 grams were decriminalized. This means that people no longer go to jail for small possessions. Instead, they may receive a fine. This was an important step towards fairness. The law also allowed members of the Rastafarian community to use cannabis for religious purpose. It further allowed cannabis to be grown and sold for medical use. A cannabis authority was created to regulate the industry and ensure that rules are followed. While this authority provides structure, Parliament must ensure that its system operates clearly and directly. In 2022, the law was updated to strengthen oversight. Medical professions must now be trained before recommending cannabis. Patients must have identification cards, and reporting requirements for authority were increased to improve accountabilities. Madam President, these were positive and necessary steps, but passing a law is not the end of the work. Parliament also has a responsibility to ensure that the law works as it was intended. For example, the law allowed certain minor past convictions to be clear. This reinforcement was meant to give people a second chance. However, if individuals cannot easily access the process to clear their criminal record, then the promise of the second chance is not fully achieved. This is why a review is important. The same applies to licensing. The authority grants licensing for growing and selling cannabis, but the process must be clear, fair, and transparent. The system must be accessible to everyone, not just large investors. Small farmers should have a real opportunity to enter this industry. A low-income individual should be excluded because of cost or lack of information. A review allowed Parliament to examine what is working well and what needs to be improved. We must all consider how different groups are affected. Young people may experience increased police attention. Women, particularly those caring for families, may face unique social and economic challenges. Small farmers may struggle with licensing fees and regulation requirements. Not everyone experiences the law in the same way, and a proper review helps us to understand these differences. We can also learn from the other Caribbean countries. In Jamaica, small possession was decriminalized and license authority was established. In Barbados, medical cannabis is carefully regulated and monitored. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the government worked to help traditional farmers translate into legal system. These countries continue to review and improve their system, and Antigua and Barbuda should do the same. Madam President, reviewing a law does not mean it has failed. It means that we are committed to making it stronger, more effectively, and more just. For these reasons, we support the establishment of the
Honorable Member, you have a minute left.
I'm just wrapping up. For these reasons, we support the establishment of this community to ensure that cannabis law remains fair, effectively, and benefit for all citizens. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. I recognize Senator Lynch.
Madam President, Honorable Chair, distinguished senators and fellow members, I rise today in my capacity as an opposition senator, fully aware of the responsibilities, tone, and procedural expectations that accompany this role. The duty of the opposition is not to oppose for the sake of disagreement. Rather, it ensures accountability, to question constructively, and to strengthen the policies placed before this House. It is our responsibility to examine proposals carefully and ask, do these decisions truly serve young people? Do they reflect equity and fairness? Honorable members, the cannabis legislation in Antigua and Barbuda did not appear overnight. It was developed after a year of national discussion, legal evaluation, and consideration of social, cultural, and economic factors. Policymakers worked to strike a balance between protecting public health, respecting cultural practices, encouraging economic opportunities, and maintaining law and order. Because of this extensive process, we must ask whether reopening this matter through the creation of another committee is truly necessary. Madam Chair, colleagues, I oppose this motion as currently drafted to establish a joint select committee to review the Cannabis Act, not because we reject reform in principle, but because the motion is flawed in scope, timing, and substance, and risks producing a weak or harmful law. Therefore, we must carefully consider whether dedicating additional time and government resources to another committee on the cannabis legislation truly reflects the priorities of the people we serve. Another concern, honorable members, is it that forming a joint select committee may unintentionally delay progress rather than promote it? Policies discussion can sometimes become prolonged debate rather than pathways to practical solutions. Instead of establishing a new committee, it may be more effective to strengthen oversight through existing parliamentary mechanisms. Regular parliamentary reviews, public consultations, and transparent reporting can ensure that the legislation is functioning properly while avoiding unnecessary delays. Furthermore, we must acknowledge that the implementation of laws is often just as important as the law themselves. Rather than reopening the legislation for review, our efforts might better be directed towards evaluating how the current policies are working in practice. Are citizens properly informed about the law? Are regulations being enforced fairly? Are committees seeing the benefits that were intended when the legislation was introduced? These questions can be addressed through existing government institutions without creating an additional committee. In this case, the creation of a joint select committee may not be the most efficient path forward. While the intention behind the motion may be well-meaning, the practical outcome may be additional delays, increased administrative processes, and diversion of the attention from other urgent social priorities. Instead, I encourage this chamber to focus on strengthening the implementation and monitoring of the existing legislation. Through transparency and public dialogue and responsible governance, we can ensure the law of Antigua and Barbuda continue to respect the rights of the citizens. Honorable members, our time, resources, and legislative energy must be directed towards the issues that will most positively impact our communities: education, youth development, economic opportunities, and social well-being. For these reasons, I oppose the motion to establish a joint committee to review the cannabis legislation in the Human Rights Act. Madam Chair, colleagues, we are not opposed to reform. We are opposed to rushed, ill-prepared lawmaking. Young people, families, and small farmers deserve an evidence-led, inclusive process that protects health, promotes fairness, and repairs the past injustice. Let us do this right and do it. Let us do this once and do it right. I urge the Senator to reject this motion as it stands and to support the alternative, properly phased approach I have set out. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Lynch. I recognize Senator McKenzie. afternoon, and thank you for acknowledging me, Madam President. I rise today as a senator in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Trade, and Barbuda Affairs to support this motion to establish a joint select committee to review the cannabis legislation in Antigua and Barbuda through a human rights and evidence-based approach. Over the past decade, this Honorable House has introduced several reforms through the Misuse of Drugs Amendment Acts and the Cannabis Amendment Act. These laws reduced criminal penalties for small amounts of cannabis, introduced a graduated penalty system, established a medicinal cannabis regulation, and created provision for domestic cultivation and institutional oversight. However, Madam President, passing legislation is only the first step. Responsible governance requires that we examine how these laws function in practice. This process, known as post-legislative scrutiny, is an essential part of effective policymaking. Today, I will focus on 3 areas: evidence-based policy, economic impact, and technology-driven development. Madam President, even well-intended legislation can fall short if it is not properly monitored or evaluated. Our medicinal cannabis framework, administered by the Medicinal Cannabis Authority, allows patients to access cannabis legally through licensed dispensaries after medical evaluation and registration. Yet important questions remain. Have these policy changes actually reduced the number of people being unnecessarily drawn into the criminal justice system? Are medicinal services equally accessible to women, caregivers, and low-income households? Because, Madam President, I've said it before and I'll say it again in this Honorable House. Policy without data is guesswork, and guesswork is dangerous. This review must apply a gender and intersectional lens, examining how law affects women, youth, caregivers, and other vulnerable groups. A joint select committee would allow Parliament to consult stakeholders, analyze data, and recommend improvements that strengthen the legal framework. Cannabis policy is not only a health or social issue. It also carries economic implications that must be carefully examined. The global medicinal cannabis market continues to expand, creating opportunities for agriculture, pharmaceutical development, research, and exports. But opportunity must be pursued wisely and responsibly. And as my granny always reminds me, Madam President, money is never too much. The committee can study whether our legislation is creating fair economic opportunities for our citizens, particularly for women, youth, and small producers. At the same time, Madam President, we must respect the wishes of the people of Barbuda. Barbudans have constantly emphasized that their development must protect their land, environment, and agricultural traditions. The committee can ensure that any economic development aligns with those priorities. Here in Antigua and Barbuda, the Medicinal Cannabis Authority has strengthened the regulatory systems, including the track and trace technology that supports the transparency and credibility for international trade. As a senator in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Trade, and Barbuda Affairs, I also recognize that understanding the economic impacts of this legislation is important for international cooperation, trade opportunities, and responsible development for Barbuda. Madam President, modern industries rely on digital systems for licensing, monitoring, and regulatory compliance. Right here in Antigua and Barbuda, the University of the West Indies Five Islands campus, particularly the School of Science, Computing, and Artificial Intelligence, and might I say, Madam President, the best school on campus, has the expertise to support these developments. Students and researchers can contribute to digital regulatory systems, data analysis, and policy tools that strengthen cannabis legislation while advancing national technological. You have a minute left, Honourable Member.
Madam President, the establishment of this Joint Select Committee reflects responsible and forward-thinking parliamentary leadership. It allows us to evaluate the real-world impact of the legislation
identify gaps, and to ensure that our framework remains equitable, economically stable, technologically advanced, and grounded in human rights. And Madam President, when we speak about responsible development, my granny's words remain true. Money is never too much, but money earned without proper policy and oversight is simply guesswork, and guesswork is dangerous. And to our opposition members, Madam President, who do not support this motion, maybe because they didn't understand it, or simply opposing for just opposing's sake, I will simply recall the words of James 1:5. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives generously to all without finding fault. Madam President, the committee is about seeking that wisdom through evidence, consultation, and responsible policy making. For the people of Antigua,
your time is up. Does anyone else wish to speak? I recognize Senator Jeremy.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I rise today to oppose this motion, not because I am against gender lens review nor post-legislation scrutiny, but today I side on the side of administrative efficiency. I have had the privilege of hearing my fellow government senators speak before me today, and while the government suggests that we need this committee to evaluate gender-responsive impacts on social data, this House has been presented with no specific data to show that our current laws are failing women. Has the government provided a single statistic showing that women are being disproportionately charged under our current laws? If not, Madam President, I believe we are establishing a year-long committee on a guess. Referencing the comments of Senator McKenzie, I believe she alluded that there has been some gender disparity when it comes to the medicinal cannabis and women being able to purchase. But in my consultations with the Medicinal Cannabis Authority, it was actually confirmed that women are actually purchasing medicinal cannabis freely without the legal stigmatization that this motion is proposing. Now, if the argument is that we need more data, then I still believe that this committee is going to be redundant. In my consultations with the technical leadership at the Medicinal Cannabis Authority, it was further established that the authority is already conducting its own internal research while simultaneously collaborating with the University of the West Indies St. Augustine campus, which has been granted a formal research license. So then I pose the question, why are we appointing politicians to a committee to perform research that the MCA and the experts at the University of the West Indies St. Augustine campus are already authorized and equipped to conduct? If the government wants more data, they should support the existing research arms of the state, rather than creating a parallel political body that will only delay the swift progress the Cabinet expects. Madam President, I took the liberty of reviewing the 2026 budget statement made last December by the Honorable Gaston Brown. And in that budget statement, I see that there is a massive US 80 million or 216 EC that has been allocated towards the expansion of the UE5 Island campus, and that was a loan that was authorized by the Saudi Development Fund. And
the current authority is moving a bit slow with his research, why are we now posing to build a 12-month study to make things even slower? Isn't this coming?
You have a minute left, honorable member.
Thank you very much. Is it possible that I get a little bit more time?
I'll give you 30 seconds.
Thank you very much. Okay. So just to wrap up, in my consultations with the technical leadership at the Medicine and Cannabis Authority, when I posed the question, do you believe that a joint select committee is needed to scrutinize the current laws, I was given this response. He noted that although it is important, it is not an immediate fix, and has stated that the funds that would be allocated towards this committee would better be spent improving the capacity of the sector itself. So, Madam President, honorable members, I would say instead of wasting resources on another year of meetings, we should be stating that the issue isn't legislation, but it's actually enforcement. And I don't think that we need a committee to enforce the rules that we already have. So I end by saying, let us enforce where enforcement is lacking. Let us refine where refinement is needed. But
to revisit the cannabis legislation. I'd like to state some of the issues that were stated to me that are quite questionable. Issues such as adequate funding. Now, yes, it is true, the government does have limited funding, but I believe through the proper measures to ensure the licensing process and taxation are enforced properly, does that not provide us with funding to put back into this movement? Paying in order to provide this cannabis, what do we do with that revenue? Do we not put it back into the government of Antigua and Barbuda? Do we not make sure to address the issues that they have stated, such as throwing off the social reform and parents feeling concerned about understand what the amendment is about? To put together the educational facilities with the Ministry of Education and also with the Ministry of Social be using it incorrectly, so they go to school. Antigua and Barbuda? Will we not will our nation not go on the mappers and new medicinal uses of cannabis? Is it our country? We do have other reasons to allocate our funds, such as roads and our to do the necessary research within this nation as representatives to ensure that this does not grow? Because I ask, if our young people continue to be is it not our job to safeguard them? And adhere to our medicinal systems